The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had grown accustomed to seeing the strange woman, who lived in the abandoned cabin at the edge of their settlement. They called her Mad Mary, though no one remembered her real name or where she had come from. She appeared in town perhaps once a month, always alone, always silent, to purchase basic supplies with coins that she somehow managed to acquire. Despite having no visible means of income, Mary Sinclair had not spoken a word to another human being in 3 years, not since the day her own husband had declared her insane and had her committed to the territorial asylum, claiming she suffered from female hysteria and delusions that made her dangerous to herself and others. Not since she had spent 18 nightmarish months in that place, subjected to treatments that would have broken a weaker spirit. Not since she had finally escaped and made her way to this remote corner of Montana territory, where she could live in peace without anyone trying to cure her of truths they refused to believe. On this particular autumn morning, Mary walked the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge with her usual measured pace, her dark hair hidden beneath a worn bonnet and her green eyes fixed straight ahead. She had learned long ago that eye contact invited conversation, and conversation led to questions she could not safely answer. The townspeople had accepted her silence as proof of her madness, and that suited her perfectly. Better to be thought insane than to risk telling the truth and finding herself back in chains. Mary's destination was Peterson's general store, where she would purchase flour, salt, and whatever vegetables were available. The storekeeper, Henry Peterson, had grown used to her pantomime communications, pointing to items, holding up fingers to indicate quantities, laying her coins on the counter without a word. He was one of the few people in town who treated her with basic human decency. Perhaps because his own daughter had been touched by melancholy after a difficult childbirth, and he understood that the mind could be fragile without being broken. As Mary gathered her supplies, she became aware of a conversation taking place near the store's entrance between Peterson and a man she didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and lean, with dark hair streaked with silver and the weathered appearance of someone who spent his life outdoors. His voice was deep and thoughtful, with a slight drawl that suggested origins further south. "I'm looking for someone to help with household management," the stranger was saying. "Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. My housekeeper moved back east to live with her daughter, and I'm not much good at domestic matters." Peterson scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well, Mr. Garrett, there's a few widows in town who might be interested in the work. Mrs. Henderson's been looking for employment since her husband passed, and Sarah Mills could use the income." "Actually," the stranger interrupted gently, "I was wondering about the woman who lives in the old Murphy cabin. I've heard she keeps to herself, which would suit me fine. I'm not much for conversation myself." Mary froze, her hands still reaching for a bag of flour. They were talking about her. Peterson's expression grew uncomfortable. "Mr. Garrett, I don't think that would be a wise choice. That woman, well, she's not quite right in the head, if you know what I mean. Never speaks a word to anyone. Some say she's touched by madness." "Madness," the stranger, Mr. Garrett, repeated thoughtfully. "And what evidence do they have of this madness? Has she ever harmed anyone, caused any trouble?" "Well, no," Peterson admitted. "She's quiet as a church mouse, pays for her goods with honest coin, never bothers a soul. But the way she keeps to herself, never speaking, it's not natural for a woman." Mary felt the familiar bitterness rise in her throat. Not natural for a woman. She had heard those words before, used to justify taking away her freedom, her dignity, her very sense of self. Apparently, silence was as damning as speech when it came to women who didn't conform to society's expectations. "Maybe she just prefers her own company," Mr. Garrett suggested mildly. "Some people find peace in solitude." Peterson shook his head. "Maybe, but I wouldn't feel right recommending her for employment. What if she had one of her spells while working for you? Could be dangerous." Mary had heard enough. She placed her coins on the counter with perhaps more force than necessary, gathered her supplies, and headed for the door. But as she passed the two men, she found herself looking directly into Mr. Garrett's eyes for just a moment. What she saw there surprised her. Instead of the fear, disgust, or pity she usually encountered, His dark eyes held only curiosity, and something that might have been understanding. He nodded to her politely, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that no one had shown her in years. Mary hurried from the store, her heart beating faster than usual. There had been something in that brief moment of eye contact that unsettled her carefully constructed walls. Mr. Garrett had looked at her as if she were a person worthy of basic courtesy, not a curiosity to be feared or pitied. As she walked back toward her cabin, Mary became aware that someone was following her. Not stalking, exactly, but keeping pace behind her at a respectful distance. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw Mr. Garrett leading a fine black horse, his long strides easily matching her determined pace despite the fact that he could have ridden past her at any time. When she reached the point where the main road branched off toward her isolated cabin, Mary paused and turned to face him directly. If he meant her harm, she would rather confront it here than lead him to her sanctuary. Mr. Garrett stopped about 10 feet away and removed his hat, revealing hair that was prematurely gray at the temples. His face was lined but kind, and when he spoke, his voice held none of the condescension she was used to hearing from men. "Ma'am," he said simply, "I apologize for following you, but I wanted to make you an offer. My name is Daniel Garrett, and I own a ranch about 8 miles north of here. I'm in need of someone to help with household duties, and I'd like to offer you the position if you're interested." Mary stared at him, her mind racing. Was this some kind of trap, some elaborate scheme to get her confined again? She had learned to trust no one, especially men who offered solutions to problems she hadn't asked them to solve. Daniel seemed to sense her suspicion because he continued speaking in that same calm, respectful tone. "I know you prefer not to speak, and that's fine with me. I'm not much for conversation myself. The work would be simple: cooking, cleaning, laundry. You'd have your own quarters, complete privacy, and fair wages. No questions asked about your past or your reasons for keeping to yourself." Mary found herself studying his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. But his expression remained open and honest, and there was something in his manner that reminded her of her father, a man who had always treated her opinions as valuable, even when others dismissed them as foolish female notions. "I understand. If you need time to think about it," Daniel continued, "if you're interested, just come by the ranch. Anyone in town can give you directions. If not, I'll respect your decision and won't bother you again." He placed his hat back on his head and mounted his horse with easy grace. "Good day, ma'am. I hope you'll consider my offer." As Daniel rode away, Mary stood frozen in the middle of the dusty road, her mind reeling from the unexpected encounter. In 3 years of silence, no one had offered her anything beyond basic commercial transactions. No one had spoken to her with genuine respect or acknowledged her right to make her own decisions. But Daniel Garrett had done both, and more disturbing still, he had done it without showing any sign of fear or revulsion at her supposed madness. He had spoken to her as if she were a rational human being capable of making informed choices. About her own life, Mary walked the remaining distance to her cabin in a daze, her thoughts churning with possibilities and fears. The offer was tempting, not just for the wages, which would make her life significantly more comfortable, but for the simple human dignity of honest work and a place where she might be valued for her contributions rather than shunned for her differences. But accepting would mean leaving her hard-won sanctuary, putting herself back in a position where she would be dependent on another person's goodwill. It would mean trusting someone again, and trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. That evening, as Mary sat by her small fire eating a simple dinner of bread and beans, she found herself thinking about Daniel Garrett's eyes. There had been something in them that she hadn't seen in a very long time, the absence of judgment. He had looked at her not as Mad Mary, the town's resident lunatic, but simply as a woman who might be able to help him with a practical problem. For the first time in 3 years, Mary Sinclair allowed herself to wonder if there might be someone in the world willing to listen to her truth without trying to cure her of it. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. That night, Mary dreamed of voices for the first time since her escape from the asylum. But instead of the cruel voices of doctors insisting she was delusional, or the broken voices of other patients crying out in their torment. She dreamed of a calm, respectful voice asking her opinion about simple, everyday matters. In her dream, she found herself responding, her own voice rusty from disuse, but growing stronger with each word. When she woke, Mary realized she had made her decision. 3 days later, Daniel Garrett was mending a fence on his property when he saw a familiar figure walking up the long drive toward his ranch house. Mary Sinclair moved with the same measured pace he had observed in town, but there was something different about her posture, a suggestion of purpose rather than mere endurance. Daniel set down his tools and walked to meet her, his heart beating faster with hope and something that might have been anticipation. As she drew closer, he could see that she carried a small bundle of belongings, and the significance of that simple fact made him want to smile. "Ma'am," he said when she stopped, a few feet away, "I'm glad you decided to come. Welcome to the Double G Ranch." Mary looked around at the well-maintained buildings, the healthy cattle grazing in nearby pastures, the evidence of prosperity built through honest labor. Then she looked directly at Daniel, and for a moment, he thought she might actually speak. Instead, she simply nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed more gratitude and determination than 1,000 words could have expressed. "Let me show you round," Daniel said, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the house. "We'll start with your quarters, and then I can explain what needs doing." As they approached the ranch house, Mary felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of belonging somewhere again, not as a curiosity or a burden or a problem to be solved, but simply as a person with something valuable to contribute. It was a fragile hope, one that could be shattered easily if Daniel Garrett proved to be less understanding than he appeared. But for the first time since her world had collapsed, Mary Sinclair was willing to take that risk. After all, she had already survived the worst that people could do to her. Perhaps it was time to discover if there was still good left in the world. 3 weeks into her employment at the Double G Ranch, Mary Sinclair had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. She rose before dawn to prepare Daniel's breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house, her afternoons tending the vegetable garden and preserving food for winter, and her evenings mending clothes or reading books from Daniel's surprisingly extensive library. Daniel kept his word about respecting her silence. He communicated through gestures, written notes when necessary, and a considerate awareness of her needs that never felt intrusive. When he found her struggling to reach something on a high shelf, he simply moved it to a more accessible location without comment. When he noticed she preferred to work alone, he made sure to give her space during her tasks while still being available if she needed assistance. But it was the small kindnesses that threatened to undo Mary's carefully constructed emotional barriers. The way Daniel always knocked gently before entering a room where she was working. The way he thanked her for meals with a sincere nod and appreciative smile. The way he left wildflowers on the kitchen table after his morning rides, never making a show of the gesture, but somehow knowing they would brighten her day. Most surprising of all was Daniel's habit of talking to her while she worked, not expecting responses but simply sharing thoughts about the ranch, the weather, or books he had read. These one-sided conversations were so natural and unthreatening that Mary found herself looking forward to them, even as they stirred longings she thought she had buried forever. "The cattle are looking good this season," Daniel might say while she prepared dinner, his voice carrying from where he sat at the kitchen table going through correspondence. "Miguel thinks we'll have one of the best calf crops in years. The new bull I bought from the Morrison Ranch is proving his worth." Or, while she dusted the shelves in his study, "I finished that book you were reading, the one about the explorer in Africa, remarkable woman, that Mary Kingsley. Makes me think there are probably a lot of women out there doing extraordinary things that never get written about because people assume women can't be explorers or scientists or anything beyond wives and mothers." That particular comment had made Mary's hands still on the book she was holding. Daniel's casual acknowledgement that women were capable of more than society allowed them was so different from the attitudes she was used to that she almost turned to look at him in surprise. It was on a Thursday evening, exactly 3 weeks after her arrival. that the fragile peace of Mary's new life was shattered. She was in the kitchen preparing Daniel's dinner when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the house. Through the window, she could see 3 men dismounting in the yard, and her blood turned to ice when she recognized the leader. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the physician who had supervised her treatment at the territorial asylum, was standing in Daniel Garrett's yard. Mary's hands began to shake as memories flooded back. The cold examining rooms, the restraints, the treatments designed to break her will and force her to recant the delusions that were actually memories too painful for others to accept. Dr. Hartwell had been convinced that Mary's refusal to admit she was mentally ill was itself proof of her insanity, and he had pursued her cure with the zealous determination of a man convinced of his own righteousness. The kitchen door opened and Daniel entered, followed by Dr. Hartwell and 2 men Mary didn't recognize. One wore a sheriff's badge, while the other was dressed in the formal attire of a government official. "Mary," Dr. Hartwell said, his voice carrying the same patronizing tone she remembered so well. "There you are. We've been looking for you for quite some time." Mary backed against the kitchen counter, her eyes darting between the men and the door, calculating her chances of escape. But she was trapped, with nowhere to run and no way to defend herself against whatever they planned to do. Daniel's voice cut through her panic, sharp with authority and barely controlled anger. "Gentlemen, you're in my home uninvited, frightening my housekeeper. I suggest you explain yourselves immediately." Dr. Hartwell turned to Daniel with the condescending smile he reserved for people he considered intellectually inferior. "Mr. Garrett, I'm Dr. Hartwell from the Territorial Asylum. This is Sheriff Morrison and Mr. Blake from the Territorial Government. We're here to collect Mary Whitmore, a patient who escaped from our facility nearly 3 years ago." "Mary Whitmore." Daniel's eyebrows rose. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake. My housekeeper's name is Mary Sinclair, and she's been in my employ for several weeks without any problems whatsoever." Mary felt a flash of gratitude for Daniel's quick thinking, even though she knew it wouldn't save her. Dr. Hartwell had too much authority, too much influence, and too little tolerance for anyone who challenged his decisions. "Names can be changed, Mr. Garrett," Dr. Hartwell said patiently, "but I assure you, this is the woman we're seeking. Mary Whitmore was committed to our care by her husband after she began experiencing violent delusions and making wild accusations against respected members of her community. She escaped during a transfer between facilities and has been evading treatment ever since." Daniel's expression hardened as he looked between Dr. Hartwell and Mary. "These accusations you mention, what exactly was she accused of claiming?" Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, consulting a document he pulled from his coat pocket. "According to the commitment papers, she claimed that her husband and his business partner were embezzling money from the bank where they worked. She also accused them of deliberately causing the death of a business rival. When confronted with the lack of evidence for these claims, she became violent and had to be restrained for her own safety." Mary watched Daniel's face as he processed this information, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would realize that she was exactly what everyone said. She was a madwoman whose delusions had destroyed her own life and now threatened to disrupt his. Instead, Daniel asked quietly, "And what happened to the husband and business partner? Are they still working at the bank?" Dr. Hartwell's expression tightened slightly. "I hardly see how that's relevant to Mary's treatment, Mr. Garrett. The important thing is getting her back into proper medical care before she has another episode." "Humor me," Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge of steel that Mary had never heard before. "What happened to the men she accused?" Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Well, as it happens, Robert Whitmore and his partner, James Crawford, left town shortly after Mary was committed. Something about business opportunities in California. And the bank failed about a year later," the sheriff admitted reluctantly. "Turned out there were some irregularities in the books, but by then Whitmore and Crawford were long gone." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary could see the moment when Daniel put the pieces together, when he realized that her supposed delusions had been devastating truths that no one had wanted to believe. "So let me understand this correctly," Daniel said, his voice deadly calm. Mary accused her husband and his partner of embezzlement and murder. Instead of investigating these claims, they had her committed to an asylum. The men she accused then disappeared, and the bank subsequently failed due to the very irregularities she had reported. And you still believe she was delusional? Dr. Hartwell's face flushed with anger. Mr. Garrett, you're not qualified to make medical diagnoses. Mary Whitmore is a dangerous woman who needs proper treatment. Her escape from lawful custody makes her a fugitive, and I have the authority to take her back regardless of your personal opinions about her mental state. Mary felt the walls closing in around her again, the familiar sense of powerlessness that had nearly broken her spirit. During her months in the asylum, she closed her eyes and prepared for the inevitable return to hell. That's when she heard Daniel's voice, steady and implacable. No. Mary's eyes snapped open to find Daniel standing between her and the three men, his posture radiating protective determination. I said no, Daniel repeated. Mary Sinclair is under my protection, and she's not going anywhere with you. Dr. Hartwell sputtered with indignation. Mr. Garrett, you're interfering with official medical business. I can have you arrested for obstruction. You can try, Daniel replied calmly. But first you'll have to explain to a territorial judge why you're trying to kidnap a woman based on the uncorroborated claims of men who are apparently fugitives themselves. You'll also have to explain why a woman who has been living peacefully and productively for 3 years needs to be confined against her will. Sheriff Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Mr. Garrett, the law is pretty clear about escaped asylum patients. The law is also clear about false imprisonment. Daniel shot back, and about the rights of citizens to due process. Has Mary been formally charged with any crime? Has she been given the opportunity to present her side of the story to an impartial tribunal? Or are we simply taking the word of men who have since fled the territory? Under suspicious circumstances, Mary stared at Daniel in amazement. No one had ever defended her before, never questioned the authority of the men who claimed to know what was best for her. The fact that he was willing to risk his own legal troubles to protect her was almost too much to comprehend. Dr. Hartwell's composure was beginning to crack. Mr. Garrett, you don't understand what you're dealing with. This woman is manipulative, dangerous. She'll fill your head with lies and conspiracy theories. The only lies I'm hearing, Daniel interrupted, are coming from men who seem very eager to silence a woman who apparently knew too much about their criminal activities. For a long moment, the kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Mary could see the three men weighing their options, calculating whether they had enough authority to force the issue against a man who clearly wasn't going to be intimidated. Finally, Mr. Blake from the territorial government spoke up. Perhaps we should table this discussion for now and seek clarification from the territorial attorney's office. The situation is more complex than we initially understood. Dr. Hartwell looked as if he wanted to argue, but Sheriff Morrison was already moving toward the door. Dr. Hartwell, I think Mr. Blake is right. We need to make sure we're proceeding according to proper legal procedures. As the three men filed out of the kitchen, Dr. Hartwell paused in the doorway and looked directly at Mary. This isn't over, he said coldly. You can't run forever. After they left, Daniel turned to Mary, his expression gentle but serious. Are you all right? I know that must have been terrifying. Mary nodded shakily, still unable to believe that she was still free, still safe. Daniel had not only defended her, but had done so without even knowing whether her claims were true. Mary, Daniel said softly, I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever happened in your past, whatever you've been through, you have my protection for as long as you need it. Mary felt tears begin to flow down her cheeks as years of suppressed emotion finally found release. For the first time in over 3 years, she opened her mouth and spoke. Thank you, she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse but clear and strong. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing me. Daniel's face lit up with wonder and joy at the sound of her voice. Mary, you don't have to thank me for doing what's right, but I'm honored that you felt safe enough to speak to me. I haven't spoken to anyone since. Mary's voice broke as she struggled with the memories. Since they took me away, Everyone thought I was mad because I knew things they didn't want me to know. You're not mad, Daniel said firmly. You're a woman who told the truth and was punished for it. But that's over now. Here, your voice matters. Your truth matters. Mary looked into Daniel's eyes and saw something she had almost forgotten existed. Genuine respect for her as a person. Not pity, not fear, not the desire to fix or cure her, but simple recognition of her worth and dignity. I was so afraid, she admitted, her voice growing stronger with each word, afraid that if I spoke, if I trusted anyone, I would end up back in that place, the things they did there, the treatments. She shuddered at the memories. You never have to go back there, Daniel promised. I'll make sure of that. Mary believed him. For the first time in years, she had found someone willing to listen without fear, to protect without conditions, to see her truth as something valuable rather than dangerous. She had found her voice again, and she was never going to lose it. The weeks following Dr. Hartwell's visit brought both freedom and fear to Mary's world. She had begun speaking again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as Daniel proved himself to be not just a patient listener but an engaged conversationalist who valued her thoughts and opinions. But the shadow of potential recapture hung over every conversation, every moment of peace they managed to build together. Daniel had not been idle during this time. He had hired a lawyer from the territorial capital, a sharp-minded woman named Catherine Morrison who specialized in cases involving government overreach and civil rights violations. Together, they were building a case that would not only secure Mary's freedom, but expose the corruption that had nearly destroyed her life. For the key, Catherine explained during her second visit to the ranch, is proving that the original commitment was fraudulent. If we can show that Mary was institutionalized not because she was mentally ill, but because she posed a threat to criminals, then we can argue that her confinement was unlawful imprisonment. Mary sat beside Daniel at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she listened to them discuss her case. Speaking about her experiences was still difficult, but she was determined to see justice done, not just for herself, but for other women who might find themselves in similar situations. I have the bank records, Mary said quietly. I hid them before Robert had me committed. I knew he would try to destroy any evidence if he got the chance. Catherine leaned forward with interest. You still have the original documents proving the embezzlement? Mary nodded. They're hidden in a place Robert would never think to look, along with a letter from Thomas Brennan, the man Robert and James murdered. Thomas had discovered their scheme and was planning to expose them. He gave me the letter for safekeeping the day before he died. Daniel's hand found hers across the table, offering silent support as she forced herself to remember those terrible days. The letter explains everything: how they were skimming money from accounts, how they planned to blame the bank's failure on poor investments, how they intended to disappear with the stolen funds once suspicion got too close. And when Thomas threatened to expose them, Catherine prompted gently, they poisoned him. Mary said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, made it look like a heart attack. Robert came home that night and burned his clothes, said he'd spilled something on them. But I saw the bottle he threw away, the same bottle Thomas had been drinking from when I found him dying. Catherine and Daniel exchanged glances. This was even more damning than they had hoped. Mary, Catherine said carefully, would you be willing to testify to all of this in court? I won't lie to you. It will be difficult. Robert's lawyers will try to discredit you by claiming you're mentally unstable. I'm not afraid anymore, Mary replied, and she meant it. I've lived in silence for 3 years, letting them win by default. I won't do that anymore. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. You won't be alone in this. I'll be with you every step of the way. Mary looked at this man who had given her back her voice, her dignity, her hope for the future. Over the past weeks, their relationship had evolved from employer and housekeeper to something deeper and more complex. They shared quiet conversations by the fire in the evenings, worked side by side in comfortable companionship during the day, and found in each other understanding that neither had expected to find again. Daniel, Mary said softly, why did you believe me? Even before you knew about the bank records or the letter, you defended me. Why? Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because I looked into your eyes and saw sanity, not madness. I saw pain, yes, and fear, but also intelligence and strength. The way you carried yourself, the way you worked, the way you treated everything in my house with such care. Those weren't the actions of someone who had lost touch with reality. Catherine smiled at the obvious affection between them. Mr. Garrett, your testimony about Mary's character and behavior will be crucial to our case. The fact that you've observed her for weeks without seeing any signs of mental instability will carry significant weight with the jury. The trial, when it finally came, was a sensation that drew spectators from 3 counties. Robert Whitmore had been extradited from California to face charges of embezzlement and murder, while Dr. Hartwell faced accusations of false imprisonment and medical malpractice. The courtroom was packed with people eager to see how a woman declared insane would fare against the men who had destroyed her life. Mary took the witness stand wearing a simple blue dress that Daniel had bought for her, her dark hair neatly arranged, and her bearing composed despite the magnitude of what she was facing. When the prosecutor asked her to state her name for the record, her voice rang clear and strong through the courtroom. "My name is Mary Elizabeth Sinclair," she said, reclaiming the maiden name she had abandoned when she married Robert. "I was formerly known as Mary Whitmore, but I no longer claim any connection to that family." The prosecutor led her through her testimony methodically, establishing her background, her marriage to Robert, her discovery of the embezzlement scheme, and the events leading up to Thomas Brennan's murder. Mary spoke clearly and factually, presenting the evidence she had preserved and explaining how she had connected the various pieces of the puzzle. When Robert's defense attorney tried to discredit her by bringing up her asylum stay, Mary was ready for him. "Mr. Henderson," she said calmly, "you're asking me to explain how it felt to be locked away for telling the truth. It felt like being buried alive. But the fact that I survived 18 months of treatment designed to break my spirit should tell you something about my mental resilience, not my instability. But surely you must admit that your claims seemed fantastic to reasonable people." Henderson pressed, a devoted husband, a respected businessman, committing murder and theft. Mary's eyes flashed with controlled anger. "Mr. Henderson, the only thing fantastic about my claims is that it took 3 years for anyone to investigate them properly. If that's a symptom of madness, then this entire legal system is insane." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and scattered applause before the judge restored order. The evidence Mary had preserved proved devastating to Robert's defense. The bank records clearly showed the systematic theft of funds, while Thomas Brennan's letter provided a detailed account of the murder plot. When the handwriting experts confirmed that the letter was genuine and that Robert's signature appeared on falsified documents, the case became a foregone conclusion. Dr. Hartwell's defense fared no better when Daniel testified about Mary's exemplary behavior and obvious sanity during her months at his ranch. It became clear that her continued confinement would have been not just unnecessary but criminal. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Robert Whitmore was sentenced to life in prison for murder and 20 years for embezzlement, to be served consecutively. Dr. Hartwell received 10 years for false imprisonment and was permanently barred from practicing medicine. As Mary walked out of the courthouse a free woman, vindicated at last, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since her youth. The truth had finally been heard, justice had been served, and she was free to build whatever life she chose. Daniel was waiting for her on the courthouse steps, his face shining with pride and love. "How does it feel to have your voice back?" he asked, taking her hands in his. "Like I can breathe again," Mary replied. "Like I'm finally myself again." "Mary," Daniel said, his voice suddenly nervous, "I know this might not be the right time, but I have something I need to ask you." Mary's heart began to race as she saw him reach into his coat pocket and pull out a small velvet box. "Mary Elizabeth Sinclair," Daniel said, dropping to one knee right there on the courthouse steps. "You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. You've shown me what it means to fight for truth, to stand up for what's right even when the whole world is against you. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life listening to everything you have to say?" Mary looked down at this man who had saved her not by rescuing her, but by believing in her ability to rescue herself. He had given her back her voice, her dignity, and her faith in the possibility of justice. Double quotes, yes, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courthouse square. Yes, Daniel Garrett, I will marry you, and I promise to never stop using my voice to speak truth, to fight injustice, and to tell you every day how much I love you. As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, the crowd that had gathered burst into spontaneous applause. Mary Sinclair, no longer Mad Mary, no longer a woman silenced by fear, had found her voice and her place in the world that evening. As they sat together on the porch of the ranch house that had become her sanctuary, Mary reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. I used to think that silence was safety, she told Daniel, her head resting against his shoulder. I thought if I never spoke again, no one could use my words against me. And now, Daniel asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Now I know that silence is just another kind of prison, Mary replied. The truth doesn't become less true just because people refuse to hear it. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is keep speaking, even when you're afraid. Daniel smiled. In the darkness, then keep speaking. Mary Sinclair, the world needs voices like yours. I will, Mary promised. For the rest of my life, I will. And in the years that followed, she kept that promise. Mary became an advocate for women's rights, a voice for those who had been silenced by society's prejudices and fears. She spoke at rallies, wrote articles, and worked tirelessly to reform the laws that allowed women to be committed to asylums, simply for being inconvenient or threatening to powerful men. She had learned that madness was often just another word for inconvenient truth, and that the greatest sanity lay in refusing to accept injustice as normal. With Daniel beside her, supporting her in every fight and believing in her every word, Mary Sinclair made sure that no woman would ever again be silenced the way she had been. Her voice, once lost to fear and oppression, had become a clarion call for justice, and she was never going to be quiet again.